Welcome to Finance Lab, a podcast for the intellectual investor, powered by DALBAR, an independent financial research firm dedicated to improving the investor experience. Finance Lab is where real investors get practical insight and perspective from real experts. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the fascinating world of finance, exploring topics like investing, financial planning, market trends, and everything in between. We're here to empower you with the tools and knowledge necessary to make informed financial decisions.
Welcome to Finance Lab. I'm your host, Cory Clark, Chief Marketing Officer at DALBAR. This is episode number 1, entitled The Journey to 100, and it covers perhaps one of the most fundamental topics of them all, cash, and more specifically, how to ensure that you never run out of it. We have with us here today Louis Harvey to discuss this topic. He's the founder and CEO of DALBAR. Lou founded DALBAR in 1976, and since that time has been relentless in his search for the forces that are shaping the world of financial services today, tomorrow, and for years to come. Under Lou's leadership, DALBAR is now recognized and respected in the financial services community for its credibility, independence, and its contributions to raising the level of excellence in the industry. Back in 2020, Lou wrote a paper entitled Prudent Asset Allocation, in which he challenged many of the long-standing beliefs in the industry related to cash needs and investments. Lou is here to share some of the insight from the research and findings that came from that paper. And he has a bone to pick with one particular rule of thumb investors have been using for generations. So you want to stick around to hear that. Lou, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, you're very welcome, Cory, and thanks for the invitation.
So we have a pretty broad topic to tackle here today. Not running out of cash. I would say that's pretty much checkmate in the retirement planning game. But as an investor, you really need to be able to think about things from the top down, don't you? Because it can be easy to lose sight of the forest for the trees. So how would you break this topic down in terms of a high-level strategic framework? Could you give us a roadmap of the forest, if you will, so that we don't lose sight of it?
Okay, delighted to do that. If we just think about money, there are really only two things that you can do with your money. You can spend it, or you can use it to earn more money. It's as simple as that. The point is, on the spending side, what you have to be cautious about is not overspending. So the title of this presentation is funding your life to age 100. That's the real concept behind it. And in order to do that, you've got to prevent overspending. As one aspect, you also have to maximize the investment side of the world. But most importantly, they have to be done separately. They can't be integrated together. So first of all, on the overspending side, you've got to set aside funds that's needed for 5 years. That's a number that we advocate and think is about the right number. We want to separate the funding that you need for that spending from the rest of your funds that can be invested more aggressively. You have to adjust your spending portfolio regularly each year to reflect changes in your own needs, preferences in the marketplace. And then finally, you need the ability to borrow from this money that's set aside to handle emergencies. So if you keep those 4 points in mind, setting aside the funds, separating the portfolio, adjusting it periodically, and borrowing from the future, you're pretty much secure that you're not going to be running out of money when you need it. The second portion of that is to maximize the investments. Clearly, money sitting idle earns you nothing. So you don't want to set aside money just because it's a good idea. You want to get it all invested. You want to get it as invested as you possibly can. And then to aggressively deploy those investments in a portfolio. And finally, to withdraw from the investment portfolio only when the market has recovered, i.e. never sell low. That may be a old adage, but it's true and meaningful today.
That sounds like a pretty simple framework when you look at it. I mean, minimize money out, maximize money in. Seems to be something that's very intuitive and that any investor could sort of hearken back to, and to be able to put any investment decision that's in front of them into perspective and context. But I'd like to unpack the spending side a little bit, if we could. I've had the pleasure of reading the paper, Prudent Asset Allocation, on a few different occasions over the years. And one of the things that stuck out to me in reading it was the concept of this 5-year period, which comes up over and over again and is very critical to the spending side of that. Could you explain where that, why 5 years, where that comes from? What's the importance of that time frame, and where did you come up with 5 years as opposed to 3 years or 6 months? Could you explain a little bit about that time frame?
Sure, would love to. But let me put it in a little context. Let's take the context of my dear friends Dan and Martha, who wanted to take a grand family vacation. They were 70 years old, and they wanted to take their kids, their grandkids, their brothers, sisters, and everybody out to this wonderful tropical island vacation. And the only downside is that it's going to cost them $100,000 to do this. If they did this, however, are they going to run out of money in 10 years? If they didn't do it, would they be losing the opportunity of a lifetime? Well, what we're going to talk about is how this spending issue gets solved, and how the 5-year issue that you mentioned, how that plays into it. By always looking ahead for 5 years, you're adjusting every year what you got wrong in the previous period. So that 5-year period happens to be a manageable time frame. Just in terms of our spending, we can think in terms of the next year and the next couple of years. Once you get out to 5 years, it becomes vague. But if you can keep updating it, it becomes a humanly comfortable level. So from the actual personal level, it's something you can manage. We're not asking somebody to manage, across generations, and certainly not the hour by hour, minute by minute kind of management that in some cases is warranted. The reason for 5 years, well, we did a lot of research in the subject and found remarkably that 100% of the S&P 500 market downturns recovered within 5 years. That's the S&P 500, as you might know, is the most commonly used index and investment vehicle that's used today. So that sort of reinforces the 5-year period. It means that if you don't have to wait more than 5 years in general for your portfolio, for your investment portfolio to recover, assuming, of course, you're in the S&P 500. We're not suggesting all of your investments be in the S&P 500, but we use that as a benchmark, as a method of looking at it. It means that if you can survive for 5 years, generally, you're not going to be losing money. The recovery of other investments differ. So I warn you, I caution you, this is not a one size fits all, but it's a rule of thumb that we think makes much more sense than some of the rules of thumb that you might hear talked about from time to time.
And 5 years really isn't a long time, and I would imagine that statistic of the S&P recovering 100% of the time within 5 years, that's a pretty calming message to potentially help with the issue of selling low, right? The panicking during a market downturn and selling low. I would imagine that's a good thing to keep in mind during that time. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And so The other thing I wanted to ask you about, because I feel like this is probably what would be on most people's mind, and you alluded to it a little bit before, but I wanted to dig a little deeper into it if we could, is a lot can happen in 5 years. It's a short amount of time, but a lot can happen. And, I'm sure, myself, I could estimate what my expenses would be over the next 5 years. But there's a good chance something unexpected is going to happen. And so how does one handle emergencies or changes in their spending that they may not have foreseen when making their 5-year forecast? How does one deal with the certainty of uncertainty?
That is a great question, probably because I have the answer. Holding your money for 5 years in 5 annual buckets, you are actually only going to be using the first year at any given point, leaving the remaining 4 years for emergencies. So if the emergency occurs in 2023, you can use the 2024, 2025, 2026 money. And then as you progress, you begin to make adjustments either in your spending or on your investment portfolio to bring things back into line. So the whole issue here is resolved. The issue of emergency is resolved by having the spending portfolio in place.
So we talked about the spending portfolio and having 5 years of cash. And so now that we look at the investment side of the portfolio, is that sort of business as usual, or has what we've done on the cash side affect what we're going to do on the investment side?
It certainly does affect it. It affects it in a major, major way. To give you a hint as to what I'm talking about, there are several rules of thumb that exist in the investment community. And I submit to you, they are always wrong.
All right. I want to get into that. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a short break here. When we get back, we'll talk about the other side of that equation, maximizing investments to never run out of cash. And Lou will go a little bit deeper into the rule of thumb that one should never blindly follow. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
This episode is brought to you by DALBAR. DALBAR is the nation's leading financial services market research firm and is committed to raising the standards of excellence in financial services. For more podcast episodes, visit financelab.dalbar.com. And now, back to the episode.
Welcome back to Finance Lab. I'm here with our guest, Louis Harvey, and we're talking about the journey to 100, never running out of cash. Before the break, Lou discussed preventing overspending and targeting cash needs for the upcoming 5 years. But next, I'd like to talk about maximizing the investments and that side of the equation. Lou hinted before the break that the strategy for maximizing investments is going to be affected profoundly by the spending side of the equation. So, Lou, what should be part of one's investment portfolio?
Well, what I'd like to do is tell you what not to do as the first step. There is a extremely popular rule of thumb that your spending should be 4% of your portfolio. Now, that principle assumes that people's needs never change. In other words, your needs at the start of the period are the same as your needs at the end of the period. It also requires that investments don't change, that the returns on the investment are neutral. Nothing happens. That time doesn't change anything. Nothing occurs over time. And most dramatically, that the past looks like the future, in spite of what's said constantly. As a matter of fact, any fixed percentage is wrong because we all differ in terms of our needs. Our investments change, our time issues change, and the past performance is never the same as the future. So my introduction to the investment side is forget the 4% rule or anything else that prescribes a percentage of the portfolio. The percentage of the portfolio is the result of an exercise, and that exercise is forecasting your cash, not a result of some idiotic formula.
Right. So the set it and forget it, or some sort of rule that every investor could use and it would be meaningful to them. I mean, on its face, as I say it, I can hardly say it with a straight face, but that it is, I guess, the easiest thing to do sometimes. But it sounds like, in any way that you want to categorize it, this is something that someone has to pay attention to and be involved in. It's not a set it and forget it type of thing. That there needs to be annual reviews.
Yeah, just keep in mind. Yeah, just keep in mind that whenever you do that, you are certain to be wrong. But the subject you asked about, there are really three categories of investments that I want to put on the table briefly at this point. One is the diversified equity investments. This is along the lines of the S&P 500 that I talked about before, but this is, investments where there's a rich history, where there's a understanding of how those investments perform over time, what the limits are, what the patterns are, how often they repeat the performance, etc. That, however, doesn't rule out the use of speculative holdings. Most investors want an opportunity to hit something out of the park. And yes, as long as it's not betting the ranch, as long as we're not investing a considerable amount of the portfolio, which again will be determined on an individual basis. The third category that we think makes good investment sense has to be the real estate. Most of us own a home, and so we need to consider that part of our investment portfolio. But there certainly is no harm in exploring investments outside of that realm.
So some, or at least one investment category that was notably absent there, I didn't hear you mention bonds or stable value funds in there. I also, heard you say a small amount of speculative holdings, not betting the ranch. So it sounds like we're somewhere in between. We're not in this traditional 40-60 allocation where we're sacrificing return in order to mitigate risk, but we're also not employing some sort of speculative trading account either. Is that fair to say that we're somewhere in the middle here?
That's fair to say, yeah. The approach is generally quite conservative without letting your money be idle. I think the danger on the investment side is letting too much of your money sit idle and managing it for the short term as opposed to managing it for the long term. And yeah, we shouldn't be taking crazy risks with our funds. Not if we want to fund our life to 100.
So Lou, is it fair to say that what we've done on the spending side of the portfolio is sort of achieving what the fixed income portion of that traditional 60-40 portfolio is doing? And that's why one can be more aggressive within the investment portfolio?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it is. It also is laddered. It's an investment term, but the whole point is that instead of just having one maturity of your bonds, you can have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5-year maturities. Again, bonds I don't think need to be the only thing that makes up the spending portfolio, but that's where they belong. They do not belong in in an investment portfolio.
And I wanted to circle back to a topic that we touched upon a little bit, but I think it's worthy of a little bit more time to talk about, and that's a topic that's near and dear to our heart, which is investor behavior. And you talked about the vulnerability, I guess you could say, that investors have in times of market turmoil, and the likelihood of selling when prices are low. How does this prudent asset allocation help with that? I know we talked about doing mid-year reviews and not a set it and forget it type of thing. But could you talk a little bit about how one should be thinking about their own behavior and how this strategy can help to mitigate some of the irrational behavior that we all experience as investors from time to time?
Sure. Let's first look at the issue of when it is that people most often make these poor behavioral decisions. And quite frankly, it's because they need the money at the time. So if you're in a situation where you need the money, you're not going to first of all look around and say, is this a good time to withdraw from the market? We, I think, through this allocation system, alleviate that problem simply because we provide for enough funding to handle the business as usual, to handle the spending until the market recovers. So we give ourselves 5 years to recover. So that addresses one aspect, and a very important, probably one of the larger aspects that allow people to make these kinds of mistakes. The other is literally the reaction to, the human reaction to the market decline. That is going online and seeing that all of a sudden, 20% of your portfolio seems to be missing. The comfort that you have, that you can expect that market to recover in 5 years, and that you have the funds to support life and emergencies until this market recovers, prevents and slows down, makes it less likely that you're actually going to go in and make that serious mistake. So we think that this incorporates a really comfortable solution for that investor behavior problem that you alluded to.
Yeah, that's a good point, because in a lot of situations, if the money is needed, the investor no longer really has the freedom to make a decision. Their hands are sort of tied. But if you have the spending portfolio and you have 5 years, it's opened the door for you to now be able to make decisions. You now have the power to make decisions, as opposed to really being compelled to make a decision because there's really no other alternative. So I guess in some cases that's not behavior. I guess open it up so that you can actually use your behavior, make a decision, and then hopefully that decision will be a prudent one. Yeah, but you got to have a choice first before you can have exhibit good behavior or bad investor behavior. You got to actually be able to behave in some way freely first to do that, and certainly having a spending portfolio provides that freedom. Well, thank you so much, Lou, for coming on and sharing your expertise on this topic with our audience today. We are out of time, but I do urge the listeners to check out Lou's prudent asset allocation paper and some supplemental materials that relate to the topic that we discussed today, as well as show notes at financelab.dalbar.com. So we will see you next time on Finance Lab. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you found this conversation valuable, please visit financelab.dalbar.com to connect with today's guest. We'll see you on our next episode of Finance Lab.